All right, Richard.
Being recorded.
Yes.
Okay.
Richard, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I remember visiting you when I was with the Community Food Security Coalition so many years ago, right after Katrina, and I saw what you created in a market there with the Federation farmers and others who had been in your market umbrella network. And now we are in a very much more crisis-prone world and on the cusp of what feels to many like an enormous cataclysm if things go poorly. And I want to hear what you think as a veteran of market creation and market strengthening for farmers markets, especially, and not only in the US, but around the world. Just what do you think these days are the critical role of markets, especially ones that are directly connecting urban and rural people?
Well, when I began my work in Louisiana in the early mid 90s, I was drawn by the a growing sense of fragility in an economy that is so heavily dependent upon extraction. Um, Funnily enough, the extractive role of oil in particular, um, and also extractive forms of agriculture that rely on essentially the plantation economy, that it meant that economically, politically, we were very fragile because it was based on sort of all eggs in one basket. And we saw an opportunity to create through imagination plus practical connection, an opportunity to create a sort of bioregional identity, a territorial identity where we in the city relate to those in the nearby rural areas and vice versa. And we thought of a number of different strategies, but most of them were beyond our resources, our limited capacity for state, for city. What was within reach was the idea of reinventing the ancient mechanism of farmers markets because you could do it today, you could do it every week. Um, it has a low overhead uh, threshold for access for the farmers. It's affordable to manage, and we can be quite flexible. When Hurricane Katrina clobbered us, we learned that the sort of scent in the air that we had for what seemed like fragility was real, and we discovered what it meant to be a climate refugee, as 80% of the city had to empty itself out and into the rest of the country. How we built it back required a great deal of stamina, the term that we grew to really resent, resilience, um, meant that we were we were seeing that, you know, our hunch that we were not stable, we were not secure was real. Um, and in rebuilding our local communities and our food system and our farmers markets, what we found is that we could restart much more quickly than supermarkets, all the kind of favored high volume mechanisms that, that feed us. And that we could resume activities much more quickly. We could utilize the shared public space as a place for healing, as a place where consumers learn how to transition from being a victim to being a protagonist in their lives because they make choices. And then we use the space for shared learning, for um, meetings, important meetings between different players and funders and government at the market itself. And so when the pandemic came, and I was by that point no longer in New Orleans, but up in New York, I saw a very similar, um, some ways more frightening, certainly global um, crises, trauma, and everything that we thought was stable was not stable. And the little work that we do in farmers markets, the pop-up economies, were generally belittled as a nicety, an anecdote, became actually the only functioning public gathering spaces. And so much so that it began to become overwhelmed by the presence of tents and umbrellas everywhere, because every shop would just set up a tent and umbrella on the street and operate. The restaurant would operate as itself as a market, selling the raw products that people wanted to buy that they couldn't get, like flour and butter and so forth. And so we began to see that actually the very simplified, cut down, ancient reinvention of the pop-up economy, the direct marketing, um, uh, was particularly relevant in that setting. It was in that setting that we established the World Farmers Markets Coalition because other markets around the world were reaching out, most notably from Rome, where the Italian farmers markets were based. In that kind of moment of anxious calm, where you're not running, markets every week, you had a moment to really think about the strategy and what will it mean when we reanimate our public spaces. How different will it be? Well, we learned that farmers markets were able to reposition themselves. This is true, especially in New York, but especially in the U.S., but also elsewhere. Is that we were able to reposition ourselves not just as events, pop-up events, but as important infrastructure and very agile infrastructure that could um, stretch out and take up more space if we need to have 6 feet in order to be safe in a pandemic setting. So that kind of flexibility was a real strength. Um, Whereas it otherwise is thought of as a weakness. But what we didn't perhaps realize as much as we do now, that we've seen Ukrainian war, now the war in Iran, and this persistent cascading crises in the long supply chain, is that we're the building blocks of the lives we lead, and we're so fortunate we can live in cities that have what, 2 weeks of supply, at best, if it's not constantly refilled. We can live these sort of luxurious lives of not needing to know where food comes from, of assuming that it'll always be there, that it'll be affordable, into now living lives where that is no longer a given. And the systems that um, uh, refuel us may actually need to be reevaluated, and that these rather anecdotal, charming farmers markets that bring in rural and peri-urban farmers to sell their goods directly into the city centers are actually very practical, because um, you can do that with little overhead. Um, it only requires that your immediate locale functions. It doesn't necessarily, it's not as directly affected by um, the global supply chains breaking down. And as a result, I think the vision of a much more decentralized, localized existence um, is no longer some kind of, green pipe dream, but may actually be a necessary step towards creating greater stability in our lives. And so when we began the World Farmers Markets Coalition at the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021, I guess that was, we were discussing the issues of the crisis in the long supply chain, and the crises of Ukrainian wheat having impact on food production and consumption in sub-Saharan Africa. These were actually very severe concerns at the time. It was creating the conditions where agricultural ministers and players were starting to reevaluate the model in which they organized the feeding in their countries. They had once, in the post-colonial stage, um, had really embraced import substitution. That had grown very unfashionable, and instead we wanted this kind of Walmart-inspired, just-in-time, globalized distribution system because that's better, it's more efficient, it's faster. Um, and I think we're now entering a stage that we do not yet have a name for this era of the sort of polycrisis. But the fact that we should be prepared, a little bit like being on an escalator, that every foot we climb is going to be one more crisis after another. So much so that we're going to forget that we're even talking about crises because this is just how it's going to be. And as a result, I think we will see, and I think it's part of the work that we are doing, is a rediscovery of import substitution, but not on a national economic scale, but maybe on a more localized one. And while the farmers markets are often still belittled for being small, boutique, and so forth, I think what's missed is that they are tangible, and as a result, we're seeing great interest throughout the global South, uh, places where people do not trust their food sources. They do not trust the imports that are coming in. They're tired of being ripped off. They're tired of exporting their food. They're tired of the middleman who steals all the profits in the traditional markets. They want some regaining some kind of control over the food system between consumers and farmers. And the great joy of the markets is that they are um, physical experiences, they're shared public experiences. And it's within that space that we're beginning to see communities reimagine, articulate, and act on what alternatives could look like. And in that regard, the farmers market, it was never meant to be an end point, but always a starting
Mhm,
point.
mhm, mhm,
It's a starting point that requires great deal of management, governance. They're much more complicated to run than they look. That's part of their success, is they look so natural and easy and simple. I think that's because it gets wired into our brains that we recognize this is something familiar. But I think in this current context, it also can help us accelerate the leap into something that may feel very unfamiliar, which is the
mhm,
future.
mhm. Richard, I am always bowled over by hearing your stories and the framing of these issues. It's so important to hear what you just said. And I know that with the World Farmers Market Coalition coinciding with the pandemic and now with even more shocking crisis levels that we're seeing all kind of merge together, the tariffs, the global conflicts, the return to imperialistic autocratic power,
Mm,
the decline of democracy. All these forces have really created a huge thirst for some kind of rootedness and stability and
mm,
preparedness. And I think what you've talked about here is such a great zone of preparedness. And I'm wondering, as you're now traveling with your Farmers Market Academy for an education of not only other farmers and farmers, potential farmer market managers, but also municipalities and national governments. I'm just wondering if the nimbleness and the capacity to quickly fill the void of supply in this case, but it's also a
mhm,
void of the relationships that might fall apart between those who have managed to feed cities and are not able to. If you feel like that scaling is going to, uh, I mean, we have examples in the ones that you've mentioned in the US. I think we probably will find other examples exist where systems have fallen apart at municipal or territorial levels, and there have been effective community response through markets and other essential services. But do you have a just in general in our last minute here? Do you have a sense of optimism about what's
Hmm.
possible in this extraordinary uncertainty?
Hmm. Optimism.
Is that a bad word?
uh, no, yeah, I think what I see is that, um, we learn best by doing. And the importance of efforts, no matter how um, short-lived, no matter how narrow in focus, but actions that engage people to do things. And not just to do them in isolation, but to do them with municipalities, or because they're doing them, they encounter municipalities because municipalities, the people who work in the municipalities may not have the vision to recognize what the wisdom and value of what citizens are trying to do. Just that engagement is itself valuable. Um,
Mm,
I think that what I was always interested in the farmers market, I mean, for one, was of course the arugula and the artichokes and so forth. But more than that was a metaphor for how our social contract could be redevised. And by physically engaging urban with rural, physically engaging with governance over difficult, tricky decisions about how many watermelon vendors should be allowed on one day, um, it it moves us from just consumers into protagonists. And it's the protagonists that will shape the future. And while national policies, of course, are always sort of the go-to that, oh, we must make some change at the national level. Um, I think this is a moment for municipalities um, to really shine, not because they possess the intellectual capital that, is needed, but because maybe they are closer to hearing from the protagonists. And I think
mm,
it's that proximity that makes that an engine for change. But it is going to require municipalities to rethink their engagement with citizens.
mm,
Because I mean, universally, whether you're talking about, you know, Ghana, Sri Lanka, China, or the US, um, farmers markets have to navigate, and farmers themselves, especially if they don't have farmers markets, are even more vulnerable if they're trying to do it directly themselves, have to, they encounter a very hostile regulatory environment. The regulatory environment is not designed for them. Therefore, we need to design it around our shared needs. And so I think it's in that process that I see the greatest hope is that we can begin to field test models that can move further up the chain to scaling. I am generally innately suspicious of scaling um, because it tends to get ossified the higher it goes up. So maybe it's a
yeah,
scaling out rather than a scaling up.
yeah, right. Now that's why I asked the question. Well, let me thank you, Richard. This was wonderful, and I look forward to sharing it with students on
Yeah, thanks,
Wednesday.
Thomas. I'm sorry I'm not there with them. I love coming to, I like the proximity of in person,
Yeah,
analog in that way.
yeah, yeah. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, you're welcome.